Hi everybody, I am Yin Jue and I am a final year student on the experimental linguistics program. So today I'm going to talk about my long essay, which is done with Wingy. So Wingy is a lecturer in UCL. She teaches psycholinguistics and general language processing. So my dissertation is also about that. It's basically an eye tracking study that looks at the processing of gender pronouns in English, like he and she. So the title, as you can read, is the influence of first language on the use of gender information during pronoun resolution in a second language. And in my presentation, I'm going to use L1 and L2 a lot. That just means, so L1 means first language or native language, and L2 is the second language. And because this study is actually focused on adult L2 learners, so those who learn a second language at a later stage of life, it's a bit different from children, like from children bilinguals. So those are people who learn both languages before the critical period, but my study is focusing on adult learners who learn English after the critical period, age of 6. Unfortunately, this experiment wasn't really completed because of a lot of disruption, like strike and COVID. And so I don't have like actual results, but I'm just gonna talk you through the background and explain about the experimental design. The experiment is a bit complicated and I'm only going to present a part of it because I don't really have time. So I actually have a lab partner, Jessie. I don't think she's here today, but she's a wonderful lady. And we work together on like getting to set up this whole eye tracking experiment. So first, I will talk about pronoun resolution. When we see or hear a pronoun like he or she, in order to understand the sentence, we need to like resolve the pronoun. So for example, John is having a hamburger. He is very happy. To understand this sentence, you need to know who does he refer to, right? So in this context, he will be referring to John. So in linguistics term, this is what we call the referent or antecedent. So John is the antecedent of the pronoun he. And there are many ways that we resolve pronouns. One of the cues that we can use is gender information. For example, John is visiting Peter. He is very happy. Who do you think he refers to in this sentence? It's actually kind of ambiguous, right? Because he can actually mean John or it can also mean Peter. So this is an example of sentence where you get an ambiguous pronoun. But let's say I have sentence 3. John is visiting Mary. He is very happy. In this sentence, who is he referring to now? It's kind of obvious that he is now referring to John, because John is the only antecedent that has a gender matching with the pronoun he. If I'm trying to like refer to Mary, I would use she, right? So as you can see, we can use gender information as a cue for us to resolve pronouns. There's a study by Anton Mendes in 2010. And what they did was they investigated the use of gender information during pronoun resolution in a group of English learners. So they kind of compared two groups of speakers that are learning English as a second language. One group speaks Spanish as their first language, and the other group speaks French as their first language. And she used a pronoun elicitation task where she just get people to talk and try to make them use pronouns, and then she just analyzed how the speakers use these pronouns. And what she found was the Spanish speakers, they produce more gender errors than the French speakers. So they will do errors like they will use he to refer to my sister, and they might use she to refer to my brother. So there's like a gender error happening there. And this is kind of interesting because she only found this in the Spanish speakers. So for French speakers, they don't really have this problem. And considering both groups, they are learning English as a second language, but only Spanish speakers encounter this problem. So what she suggested was because this is due to Spanish having a property called prodrop, that causes Spanish speakers to have difficulties using the correct pronoun. Okay, so some of you might be asking what's a prodrop. Some languages, like Spanish, Japanese, Chinese, Italian, they have this property called prodrop, and it basically allows a subject to be empty. So, for example, I can't read Spanish, so I'm just going to read the English word by word translation. Anthony went on vacation with Simon, enjoyed a lot the beach. In this example, you see in the second sentence, there is no subject. It's an empty subject. And in linguistic terms, sometimes we call it pro. So if I actually say this in English, enjoyed a lot the beach, it doesn't really make any sense, right? But for Spanish speakers, it's grammatical, so they allow this to happen. And in this case, when I'm using an empty subject, I'll be referring to the subject of this whole conversation. In this case, it will be Anthony. So Anthony is enjoying a lot the beach. The important thing here is because that Spanish has this property called prodrop, and pronouns can be dropped, so they're used less often. And in this case, they don't really need to use gender information that much when speaking Spanish, because it's not really required to like match the gender of the pronoun and the gender of antecedent. And so the author argued that because of this, that means the gender information will not be encoded in a semantic representation of Spanish speakers. Semantic representation is like an abstract concept of like, there's this part of your brain that forms a representation of language. So, for example, if I'm like an English speaker, so I'll say, Anthony went on vacation with Simon. When I see like words like Anthony, which is an antecedent, I will store the gender information in my representation. So, for example, Anthony is a male. Okay, I will put that information in my representation. Anthony is a male. So whenever I encounter a pronoun, let's say I encounter he, I know that he matches Anthony. So that's one possibility there, that he might be referring to Anthony. But for Spanish, because the gender information might not be encoded in the semantic representation, so that might cause a problem when they are speaking. As I said, so Anton Mendes, they investigate pronoun production. So when the Spanish speaker is trying to speak in English and he tries to use a pronoun, because gender information is not encoded, they are likely to make error because they just don't do a matching of gender right there. And this gender pronoun errors is also found in Mandarin Chinese. So some work by Dong and colleagues have showed that Chinese speakers tend to use the wrong form of gender pronouns when learning English. And we know that Mandarin Chinese is also a prodrop language, but there's also another prominent feature of Chinese where the spoken Chinese doesn't have gender marked pronouns. Pronoun in spoken Chinese is like gender neutral. I don't differentiate between he or she, I just say the same pronoun for them. So it's called ta. Basically, we have a question here. So will the use of gender information in the pronoun be affected because of the missing gender marked pronouns? In this case, pronouns are gender neutral. Or is it because of the prodrop property? So we have the current study, and we try to explain what is causing these gender pronoun errors. So the previous literature suggests that the production errors are caused by language processing, and we want to find out whether this is the case, whether these gender errors are mirrored in pronoun processing. And in general, we're trying to investigate the influence of first language on second language, or what we call the L1 transfer. But more specifically, we're looking at the properties of the language that can be transferred. So in this case, either prodrop property or the property of the gender marked pronouns that will influence L2 pronoun resolution. Okay, so the language groups that we compare in this study are 4 language groups. First is the native English speakers, and then we also compared 3 groups of L2 English speakers. They are the Spanish, Chinese, and French group. So Spanish, we know it's prodrop and it has gender marked pronouns. Chinese is also prodrop, but it doesn't have gender marked pronouns. And French is similar to English, so it's a non-prodrop and it has gender marked pronouns. So in this experiment, we're using the French speakers as a baseline of comparison because we don't want to compare the Spanish and Chinese group to the English group because they are L1 speakers and L2 speakers. So there might be a bit of difference in the processing of first language and second language. So we will be comparing between the L2 groups. And we can form 3 hypotheses. Firstly, only the absence of gender marked pronouns in L1 will cause a difficulty in L2 pronoun processing. In this case, so only the Chinese speakers will encounter a difficulty because they don't have gender marked pronouns. And the second hypothesis is both absence of gender marked pronouns plus the presence of pro-dot property will cause a difficulty in using information to resolve pronouns in L2. So in this case, both Spanish and Chinese speakers will encounter difficulty. And finally is the null hypothesis. So that means neither of these properties will cause a difficulty. And to test this, we are using a visual eye tracking paradigm. This is where participants will see a picture on the screen while hearing an audio and will record their eye movements. And this paradigm is very useful for investigating language processing. For example, if you see at the right of the screen, say for example, this is the screen and the participants will see two pictures, so a guy and a girl, and then they will hear a sentence saying, John and Mary went to a cafe, he bought a coffee. By the time they hear he, they will look towards the picture of the guy because it matches the pronoun, right? The gender matches the pronoun. So we get to know like what is actually happening underlyingly in their language processing because we will be tracking their eye movements and all the participants do is just like look at the screen and then hear sentences. And they don't need to do like meta-linguistics response. Like they are not asked to answer questions which will actually affect their comprehension process. So this is a good method to allow us to investigate the real-time language processing. And so for the experiment design, there are two independent variables. First is the gender ambiguity, so we manipulated that. And there are two conditions, so either gender ambiguous or gender unambiguous. And then we also have the between subject independent variable, which is the 4 language groups that we're comparing. And we will be recording their looks to target using the eye tracking data. So basically here is an example of a stimuli. On the left, you can see there's the ambiguous condition. There will be 2 pictures that have the same gender, in this case, so 2 guys. And then they will hear a sentence like John and Peter went to a cafe, he bought a coffee. By the time they hear the pronoun he, they actually don't know who does he refer to because it can be John or it can be Peter. So in this case, there's actually a 50% chance of looking to either of this one picture. And until they hear the word coffee, then they know, okay, so this is actually target. But before that, if they are only listening to the pronoun, then they don't know which is target. In contrast, in the unambiguous condition, you have like 2 different genders. So by the time they hear the pronoun he, they know that the target is a guy. So what we are comparing is actually the difference of their performance between the ambiguous condition and the unambiguous condition. So if they are able to use gender information successfully, that means at the ambiguous condition, there will be like 50% chance, right? So if they are using the gender cues, then in the unambiguous condition, maybe they will look at the target like 100% of the time. So that we can see there's like a 50% difference, for example. But let's say they have like difficulty using this gender information. Then when they are at the unambiguous condition, they cannot use it successfully. They maybe only look at the target 60% of the time. Then you can see like the difference will be maybe just 10%, so it's smaller. And this is what we call the ambiguity effect. And by comparing this ambiguity effect, it tells us whether that group of speakers encounters a processing difficulty. So I don't have results, so I'm just going to show you some predictions. Here are some fake graphs. So first of all, if hypothesis 1 is correct and absence of gender marked pronouns will cause a processing difficulty, then we will see the ambiguity effect in the Chinese group is much more smaller than all the other groups, right? So the difference between the orange and the blue bar here is smaller because Chinese doesn't have gender marked pronouns. It's gender neutral. So they have a difficulty here. If hypothesis 2 is true, and both gender marked pronouns and product property will cause the processing difficulty, then we will see the ambiguity effect for both the Chinese group and the Spanish group will be smaller than the baseline, which is the French group here. So all of them are L2 speakers, but Spanish and Chinese speakers will have a smaller ambiguity effect than the French speakers. Finally, if the null hypothesis is correct and neither of these properties will contribute to L1 transfer, then we will see that there's no difference in the three L2 groups here. So they might all be able to use gender information successfully, maybe more than 80% of the time. And in addition, if there is a general L2 processing difficulty, that means if L2 language processing is like maybe slower than L1 processing, then you will see that there's a difference between the three L2 groups and native English speakers group. But if all four groups are performing the same and there's no significant difference, that means that the L2 speakers, they are able to achieve a native-like proficiency. So what does this tell us about? So if either hypothesis 1 or hypothesis 2 is true, then we will observe an L1 transfer in terms of pull drop or gender marked pronouns. And this will suggest that the gender information might not be automatically activated for Spanish and Chinese speakers. That's why they are more likely to make these gender pronoun errors, because they have a problem with processing the pronoun in the first place. And if this is true, then English teachers that teach English as a second language, they should really take this into account, because previous literature has shown that teachers tend to neglect this gender pronoun errors because they thought it's something that happens at random, but actually it's not random. It's a systematic error. So teachers should really develop the correct strategy to train these speakers. But of course, more research has to be done to know which training will be useful. But what if we don't find an L1 transfer effect, right? Then that will mean that these gender pronoun errors that we see is not something due to language processing. It might be due to difficulty at later stages during language production. And in order to know that, we need to do more research on it. But in conclusion, this is actually the first study that tries to use a visual eye tracking paradigm and compare pronoun resolution in L2 speakers from different language backgrounds. So we're not just comparing native speakers and L2 speakers like what previous study did, but we're comparing L2 speakers from different first language background, which tells us a lot more about what's happening with this L1 transfer. And more importantly, we are focusing on these very specific properties. So in this case, pull drop and gender marked pronouns. And as I said, so we try to provide explanation to these gender pronoun errors. Unfortunately, this study wasn't carried out. But you can see this study actually tries to answer a lot of questions, and it provides a basis for more research in this field. So that's actually all. I hope you get to follow. It's really complicated design, and I really try to simplify it. For me, in general, I just feel there's a lot of research to be done in linguistics, and you can see that we're actually focusing on really, really specific stuff. For example, my whole study is just about pronoun. And already it's so much things going on behind there. So if you're interested in, you should really dive into linguistics.